She had spent her whole life overcoming obstacles.
We were separated as siblings.
She was in foster care.
She was essentially abandoned.
Mom always takes care of me.
Still, she'd built a successful life.
She got her degree in sociology.
We celebrated, and I was proud of her.
I'm Burgess.
Then she'd found the perfect man to share it with.
They were inseparable.
They just connected so well.
She wanted to marry this man.
But they would never say I do.
He burst in the front door yelling, "Call 911."
He said, somebody just tried to kill your mom.
He was covered in blood.
Hers and his own.
He was stabbed deep. This is a whole lot worse than we thought.
They needed to get him to the hospital.
But it's the truth behind the vicious attack that will really take everyone by surprise.
It was unbelievable.
It's almost like you gotta be kidding me. This is insane.
August 25th, 2014. It's a warm summer Monday in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a thriving city built on the tobacco industry and multiple educational institutions.
We have Winston-Salem State University, as well as Wake Forest and Salem College. So a lot of people come by way of attending one of those colleges.
It's about 300,000 people here. It's a combination of a small town feel with ambitions to be a big city like Charlotte.
But as most residents enjoy a peaceful evening, one home is erupting in chaos.
19-year-old Jasmine Moore is at home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
She's sitting on the couch watching TV when her mother's boyfriend, 52-year-old Fergus Moore, bursts in the front door.
Call 911.
What happened?
Hurry.
He's dripping in blood. It's all over him.
I got stabbed.
I imagine she probably was overwhelmed just seeing Fergus bloody.
But that's not the worst part.
He said somebody just tried to kill your mom.
She's in the driveway bleeding out.
Call 911. Your mama been stabbed.
Year-old Cheryl Bethea had worked hard to build a good life for her family.
She was bold, tenacious, had a big, beautiful smile.
She had a huge heart. She loved her two children, she loved her grandson, and she loved her sisters.
But Mom always takes care of me.
Mama makes sure she has what she needs.
Anything that I wanted, she made sure me and my brother had it. She just loved us so much.
But it hadn't always been easy.
Cheryl was in foster care when she was younger.
Thankfully, she was able to meet with her blood sister in foster care.
Well, we were put into our last foster home. We ended up staying with them until we became adults, which is very rare because if you don't adopt, they usually take you from the home.
But she was determined not to let her hardships define her life.
In her early 20s, she got married and started a family of her own.
Cheryl and her husband welcomed a son first, and 2 years later, they had a daughter.
She loved becoming a mom, and she loves her children, period.
However, her marriage was a different story.
Cheryl still had some deep-rooted fears of abandonment and rejection, and that eventually led to her and her first husband separating.
She was married a second time, and that didn't work out either.
She struggled with being abandoned, self-love, lacking love and belonging.
Until, as Cheryl matured into her 30s, she decided to refocus on herself.
She eventually went back to school and she got her degree in sociology.
She made great grades, basically all A's.
She graduated from Winston-Salem State University, and she was really excited that she was able to do that as a single mother.
We celebrated, and I was proud of her.
Her daughter may have been proud, but Cheryl still craved more.
She was like, I'll be the first one in my family to have my master's. That was her next goal. She was determined.
And she was always on the go.
Cheryl used to be involved in a lot of things. She was in Black Girl Run.
She would go to races and she would run alongside ladies when they were about a quarter of a mile away from the finish line, and she would cheer them across the finish line.
She was also very involved in her church community.
But as her kids neared adulthood, Cheryl faced new challenges.
Her daughter Jasmine got pregnant shortly before her high school graduation.
At first, she kind of felt like having a baby, it just wasn't the right time. But once I had the baby, she absolutely loved him.
But for all the joy her grandson brought, there was still something missing.
In her heart, she was looking for companionship and somebody to kind of share life with. And along comes Fergus.
Fergus Moore was a family friend, about 10 years older than Cheryl.
They met at one of our cousins' parties.
They lock eyes from across the room, and really, it was love at first sight.
Hey, I'm Cheryl. I was wondering when you was gonna come over here and say hello.
Okay, I'm Fergus. Nice to meet you, Cheryl. How you doing?
I'm doing fine.
They just connected so well.
And even though Cheryl had every intention of taking things slow, she didn't hold back.
So I seen you looking at me.
Cheryl and Fergus were inseparable. They were seeing each other every day, hanging out and having a blast.
Eventually, they decided that they wanted to move in together.
After years of raising her kids on her own, Cheryl felt she finally had someone else to help share the load.
She is happy about having a helping hand around the house.
She wanted to marry this man.
But now, everything Cheryl has worked so hard for may be in jeopardy.
Please hurry.
I don't know what to do. I'm panicking. I can't find no phones.
After what feels like forever, she finds one.
911, what's your emergency?
It's my mom.
She's hurt?
The call came out, and it was assault on a female.
Come on, baby, stay with me.
When first responders arrive, they find Fergus on the ground, holding on to Cheryl.
It's gonna be okay, baby. They're here now.
He seems to be comforting her and rocking her.
But Fergus is also in grave danger.
He was stabbed deep. It was a sucking chest wound.
The officers at the scene render what aid they can.
I knew that EMS was coming, so I'm laying direct pressure on this guy, and I was like, hang on, man.
Save her, man.
But all Fergus could think about was Cheryl.
He's saying, I don't know what happened. He stabbed us. Is she going to be okay?
43-year-old Cheryl Bethea had overcome a lifetime of tragedy and hardship to build a happy life for herself, her children, and her grandchild.
She was a hard worker every day, making sure she provided for her children.
She just loved us so much.
But now police are scrambling to save Cheryl and her boyfriend, 52-year-old Fergus Moore, after a vicious knife attack in their front yard.
She was severely stabbed multiple times.
Fergus had also been stabbed in the chest.
I remember thinking, this is a whole lot worse than originally we thought.
And it's about to get even worse.
It's too late for Cheryl. Her carotid artery was severed.
Oh no. Oh no.
The EMT pronounces her dead. And as Fergus is loaded into the ambulance and rushed to the hospital, the officers secure the scene.
Miss Bethea was kind of wedged between the car tire and the curb.
It was a very disturbing scene.
Let's go.
And as detectives arrive to piece together what happened, it's immediately clear this was no random attack.
There was no property taken from either Cheryl or Fergus, so it didn't appear to be a robbery.
The severity of the injuries also made it seem like the attacker could have known either Cheryl or Fergus.
Stabbing someone is so personal.
And as the sun sets, detectives head inside to speak to Cheryl's daughter, Jasmine.
Thank you. We'll take it from there.
After they got the crime scene together, they asked me questions.
We're sorry for your loss. Can you walk us through the evening before everything happened?
Well, Mom came home from work and decided to go for a run before dinner.
I'm getting ready to go for a run, baby.
Okay, all
I'll be
right.
back in just a little bit.
All right, be safe.
She'd only been gone a few minutes when Fergus came home.
Hey, where's your mother?
Baby's sleeping. She went out for a run.
Fergus came home from work early.
Fergus paced about in the house for a bit and then decided to go outside and wait for Cheryl's arrival.
Had a good run.
After a while, her mom did come in.
I'm gonna start on dinner.
And after starting dinner, Cheryl went back outside with Fergus.
Jasmine said she did hear Fergus and her mom talking in the background outside, but she didn't really pay much attention.
Did you hear anyone else out there with them?
No, not that I could tell.
But after a while, she thought she heard screaming.
But before she could actually get outside to see what was happening, Fergus was at the door screaming to call 911 because somebody had attacked her mother and tried to kill him.
According to Jasmine, she looked for the phone to call police.
I'm panicking, like my adrenaline is rushing.
I only went out there once the police got here.
That's when I seen my mom wedged in between the concrete and my car. She was lifeless. And I just dropped to my knees. It was blood everywhere. It was all on the door. It was all on the concrete. It was blood running down the street. And it was really traumatizing for me.
Oh, no. She's not gone, is she?
Do you know if your mother had any enemies?
Not at all.
Her mother was church going. Her mother was very involved in the community.
Who would want to do this to her? Or Fergus?
But when detectives ask about her mother's relationship with Fergus, Jasmine admits there were some issues.
It just wasn't good.
Jasmine says that the two would argue constantly.
My mom actually told me she was going to leave him.
Cheryl Bethea's daughter has just told detectives investigating the brutal stabbing that left the 43-year-old dead that her mother had been planning to break up with her boyfriend, Fergus Moore.
And Jasmine said that suited her just fine.
In the beginning, Jasmine and her brother were a little bit leery about Fergus coming into their lives.
Part of that was because when he met Cheryl, Fergus was unemployed.
Fergus was a little bit down on his luck and was trying to find a way to kind of get back on track.
I couldn't really have any say-so in who my mom dated. Like, at the end of the day, it's her decision.
Jasmine says that at first, their worries about Fergus appeared to be ill-founded.
Jasmine told the detectives that everything started out really well.
They got along and it was good.
Their mother seemed to be so happy, and felt like she had finally found a partner.
Once they started dating, Cheryl helped Fergus get back on his feet.
She found him a job at a chicken plant.
He also moved in.
They were a little surprised at how quickly things moved, but he was able to help with the family responsibilities and the household bills, and both of them seemed really happy.
However, it wasn't long before things started to change.
That's when, like, I guess his true colors were coming out.
He would come home with shoes and clothes and all sorts of things for himself, and Cheryl felt like he wasn't contributing to the household as much.
So that became a strain in their relationship.
They started fighting about money.
And Cheryl's daughter was often caught in the middle.
He would say nasty words to me. He would call me all kinds of names.
The house was just very tense, and it was very uncomfortable for everyone.
It became such a disruption in their environment that her brother didn't even want to be home most of the time.
And Fergus apparently felt the same way.
He was gone, doing something else, working. Like, he didn't really interact with us.
He would find any excuse that he could to be out of the house.
Jasmine says that her mother had eventually asked Fergus to move out.
She just was done, fed up.
I felt like she was kind of like, what did I get myself into?
But Fergus soon found a way to creep back in.
She did like him, care for him. She was like, everybody gets second chances.
She let him move back in?
Yeah.
Can't take on this responsibility by myself.
And despite the chances she gave him, Fergus never changed.
They'd fight, she'd kick him out, and then he'd come crawling back.
They would smooth things over and the process would start again.
To be honest, I think that's what they were talking about before they got attacked.
The detectives suspect Jasmine may be right.
Maybe this time, Cheryl told Fergus to get out for good.
They were asking me, did he do it? And I was like, I'm not really sure.
I mean, they'd fight a lot, but for him to actually kill her, I don't know.
When you have a loved one who is in a relationship where they're not being treated how you would want them and hope for them to be treated, it is complex and hard.
I've never experienced anything like this before. So this was all new to me, and I didn't really know how to handle the situation.
When they wrap up the interview, the detectives ask if they can take a look around the house.
Sure, if you think it'll help.
Investigators searched the house, trying to piece together what exactly happened here. At first, they didn't really notice much. However, when they went into the kitchen, they noticed a knife block on the kitchen counter.
One knife is missing.
And in addition to a possible murder weapon, detectives find a potential motive in some of Cheryl's papers.
They found a restraining order.
One that Cheryl had taken out against Fergus.
It was filed that very same day.
Detectives investigating the brutal murder of Cheryl Bethea have discovered that just hours before her death, she had taken out a restraining order against her boyfriend, Fergus Moore.
But Fergus was also severely injured in the knife attack that killed Cheryl.
So Fergus is currently in surgery while they're searching the house and finding these things.
Which does give credence to his claim that some unknown assailant attacked them both.
However, the detectives can't ignore the fact that the restraining order gives Fergus a solid motive.
Is it possible that Fergus had killed Cheryl and then stabbed himself to deflect suspicion?
It seems far-fetched, given the severity of his injuries.
To actually perform this act and then to take it even further to inflict a wound on himself. That's insanity.
At that point, you have your doubts about what happened, but you have to shake every tree and see what falls out of it.
The detectives head back to the station and dig into Fergus's background.
They discovered that about a decade ago, Fergus had served 4 years in prison for armed robbery.
He has numerous domestic violence offenses against women on his record.
The earliest was way back in 1989.
All he got was a $65 fine and probation.
And based on the police records, it appears that Cheryl had suffered similar abuse.
Cheryl herself had filed reports of domestic violence against Fergus very recently.
For the detectives, it's yet more evidence suggesting that Fergus isn't just a second victim.
But until he's out of surgery and in recovery, the detectives aren't able to question him.
They decide to speak with Cheryl's sister in the meantime to get some more background information.
It was already all over the news, and that was just the worst experience I've had in my life.
Though devastated, Cassandra agrees to come down to the station for an interview.
We're sorry for your loss.
Her immediate response was that she was afraid something like this would happen. She says that as much as Cheryl tried to downplay any abuse, she knew for a fact that it was an abusive relationship.
I was on the phone with her one time, and they started cussing at each other, and they were arguing.
She says she questioned Cheryl several times, and Cheryl just said that that's how they are with each other.
It's like, it's none of your business. Oh, this is just how we do.
Did you ever see him hit her?
Well, no, not directly.
But she did see the results of what had transpired.
She had a black eye one time, and I asked her about it, and she said she fell and hit the table.
But that never sat well with Cassandra.
She said Cheryl even made several posts on social media talking about her clumsiness, and she believed it was just a way to deflect from the injuries.
It was like she never wanted us to know her business.
The problem, of course, with domestic violence, people who are in domestic violence situations, is they don't tell anyone.
But recently, she started to open up a little bit.
Eventually, Cheryl said that Fergus was violent with her. And when he was drunk, it got much worse.
He even threatened to kill Cheryl.
And according to what Cheryl told Cassandra, he may have tried too.
It got so bad that Cheryl confided that one time, Fergus had smothered her with a blanket and beat her with a hammer.
Cassandra tells detectives that Cheryl started spending as much time as she could outside of the house.
When she wasn't able to be outside of the house, she would make up any excuse for her sister to come over.
She really wanted someone there because she was beginning to fear for her life.
I made her promise that she would file a restraining order, and that's exactly what she did.
If it is granted, then if the people do share a residence together, then the person who is the defendant, who has been identified as the abuser, has to leave that residence.
But it's beginning to look like it was too little, too late.
She's not exactly sure how Fergus could have found out about the restraining order, but she believes that when he did discover it, he was so enraged at the thought of losing permanent access to Cheryl that he just exploded in anger.
For the detectives, it's an all too familiar scenario.
You offer the help, you offer the brochures, you lock up the assailant, you'll take them to the battered women's shelter. You do all the things, only to go back 6 months later and deal with, if not the same thing, something worse.
We see folks in our community who are killed by domestic violence, and it happens every year. A lot of times those folks were trying to handle it on their own, and it takes community.
Oftentimes, it's incredibly difficult for people who are involved in abusive relationships to leave them.
But before law enforcement can make any sort of arrest, they need to speak with Fergus.
Homicide.
And by morning, it looks like they'll get their chance.
Fergus is finally awake and alert out of surgery.
And he says he's ready to talk.
We'll be right there. Got something. Gotta go.
Detectives have just learned that Cheryl Bethea's boyfriend, Fergus Moore, is out of surgery and ready to discuss the incident that put him in the hospital and left Cheryl dead.
At the scene, Fergus told Cheryl's daughter that an unknown assailant had attacked them both.
No, she's not gone.
The detectives suspect that's a lie.
However, when detectives speak to Fergus in the recovery room, they don't immediately confront him with what they've learned.
We have a few questions, so we need to ask you.
As an investigator, you never want to lead somebody that you're interviewing. You want to hear and observe everything that they're offering.
They start the interview by telling Fergus that Cheryl is dead.
Fergus immediately breaks down.
Why don't you tell us what happened that night?
Jasmine said you came home early?
Fergus said that he had been frustrated with his job. He had been thinking about leaving for a while, and that was the day he finally decided to submit his resignation.
He thought that he and Cheryl would celebrate.
Although he didn't wait for Cheryl.
Fergus had came home and he already been drinking. He had a whole bottle of liquor in the car and the bottle was basically empty.
When he got home, he asked Jasmine where her mother was, and she said that she had gone out to run. So he decided to go outside, get some fresh air, and wait for her return so that they can talk.
And she did. I mean, that's what we did. We talked about it.
I'm so excited, baby. This is a good day for you. You know what to do.
As they were outside talking, a random person just started attacking them.
I tried to stop him, but there wasn't much I could do.
And then when he jumped in and tried to defend Cheryl, he himself got attacked.
Can you describe the guy?
I don't know. It all just happened so fast, man.
Fergus says he was focused on helping to save Cheryl.
But the detectives suspect there's another reason Fergus can't describe Cheryl's killer.
They reveal that they know about the restraining order.
That catches Fergus off guard initially, but eventually he starts to change his tune.
Yeah, she had an order out on me, but it's not what you think.
Fergus says that Cheryl was the one who was abusing him in the relationship.
This is supposed to be a happy day. We're not happy.
And he admits that prior to the stabbing, they had been having an argument out on the porch.
Pay all the darn bills.
And let me guess, things got out of hand.
Yeah, man, but it wasn't me.
We haven't even talked about this. Baby, how?
He says that in the middle of the argument, Cheryl suddenly went inside.
Where you going?
I'm going to start dinner.
Fergus tells police that she grabbed the knife, she came back outside.
That's when she stabbed me.
No, what's wrong now? I'm tired.
He says that he had to wrestle her down to get the knife away from her.
That could explain some of the superficial wounds he had on him.
And he said that he started stabbing her because he was in fear for his life.
So why you didn't just say that in the beginning?
I knew how that looked.
He admits that he threw the knife into the bushes and ran up to the front door to ask Jasmine to call 911.
The detectives don't necessarily believe Fergus's story.
But then again, he came pretty close to dying in the attack too.
It could go either way here. It could have been that Cheryl was finally fed up with Fergus and the abuse, and as she went inside to prepare dinner, she grabs a knife from the kitchen block and finally stands up for herself and attacks Fergus. Or it could be that Fergus took the knife, went outside and waited for Cheryl's return and attacked her.
You had a good run?
I did.
We'll be back.
Leaving Fergus in the recovery room, the detectives head back to the crime scene.
If this fella is telling the truth, you have to run every lead down as if what is being told to you is the gospel.
They look in the bushes and they discover the knife.
They are able to match it up to the knives that are from the same block set.
Detectives?
But the real breakthrough comes while one of Cheryl's neighbors approaches the detectives as they're leaving the property.
I didn't want to say anything at first. I was afraid of what Fergus might do.
She says with Fergus safely in the hospital, she felt that she could tell detectives exactly what she witnessed.
She tells them that she saw everything.
At first, the neighbors' recounting of events matched Fergus's story.
I saw Cheryl leaving for a run.
The neighbor says Fergus came home a few minutes later.
She saw him go inside, and then, a little while later, she noticed him come back outside and pace up and down on the front porch.
And according to the neighbor, when Cheryl came home, she was surprised to see him.
Oh, so this is what we're doing now? Fergus, what are you doing here?
At first, they seemed to be having a conversation, but it didn't take long before that turned into a yelling match.
Who is it?
He apparently believed that she had been cheating on him.
Who you been seeing? Don't be ridiculous, Fergus. Oh, I'm nobody.
Cheryl went inside, and according to the neighbor, when she came back, things turned violent.
Cheryl came back outside, and the neighbor said that's when she saw a knife.
You're not supposed to be here.
And the person with the knife was Fergus.
Just start stabbing her.
What is wrong with you?
Cheryl Bethea's neighbor has just revealed to detectives that she witnessed Cheryl's boyfriend, Fergus Moore, attack the 43-year-old mother of two.
She says Cheryl started backing up into her daughter's car, leaned up against the car door, and started begging for her life.
Fergus, please stop.
It seemed like Fergus had already made up in his mind what he was going to do.
He just had so much rage. He just stabbed her over and over.
I don't think there's anything anyone could have done to stop it.
Cheryl had attempted to get away from him, but he did not want to take no for an answer.
Cheryl never stood a chance.
As horrifying as the attack had been, Cheryl's neighbor says what happened next was even more shocking.
The neighbor said that he stabbed himself in the chest.
Thought maybe he was trying to kill himself.
But it wasn't a murder-suicide.
He threw the knife into the bushes and then ran to the house to tell the daughter that they had been attacked.
After he killed Miss Bethea, he probably realized, I better do something to make this look real.
People go to extreme lengths to cover up their crimes.
Once they have the neighbor's statement, the detectives get a warrant for Fergus's arrest.
When Fergus is released from the hospital, he goes right into police custody.
But when detectives confront him with what they've learned from the neighbor, Fergus denies it.
Burgess still maintains that everything that transpired was in self-defense.
And as the case moves toward trial, prosecutors plan to seek the maximum possible penalty.
The prosecutors indicted him for first-degree murder, and they also said that they were going to pursue the death penalty.
Cheryl was stabbed 39 times. And Burgess had several previous convictions and charges for violent offender crimes.
His defense team, however, has another strategy.
The defense team calls Burgess's intellectual capacity into question.
To the dismay of Cheryl's friends and family, the court ordered a mental evaluation.
It's almost like it was a joke to them. That's what it felt like. This man is evil, and he did this, so why are we going through this?
We all was on pins and needles. I just wanted justice for Cheryl and her family.
But the family would be in for a long wait.
They decided that he was incompetent to stand trial.
And therefore, he should be exempt from the death penalty and receive a plea deal.
Based on the findings, the prosecutors agree to a deal.
Burgess enters a guilty plea to the lesser charge of second-degree murder.
Per the terms of the deal, the judge sentences Burgess to 35 to 43 years in prison.
He was 57 at the time.
Burgess tells the court that he understands at his age that sentence is tantamount to a life sentence.
But the people most affected by his crime are still devastated by the outcome.
I was disgusted with him, especially when he tried to play like he was just innocent. That really made me angry. He deserved the death penalty.
What you gonna get done to your hair?
But Mom always takes care of me.
In the aftermath of Cheryl's death, her family does manage to find some solace in preserving Cheryl's legacy.
I promised Cheryl that I would not allow her death to be in vain. So Jasmine and I speak in the community on domestic violence.
Everybody knows that she was a very loving person, and her legacy is never gonna die. We're gonna keep it going.
The family's activism has ultimately led to a foundation that raises awareness about domestic violence.
We wanted to find a way to give back to the community, especially to women who are going through their big changes and journeys, and they have to drop everything and leave.
They hold events and raise money to support women and children in the local domestic violence shelter.
That's kind of how we give back and show love to the community.
But for all the good that's come in the aftermath of Cheryl's death, her family still mourns the loss of the woman they love.
She's very missed. We all miss her.
I got to a point where, okay, I just picked up a paintbrush and a canvas and I just started painting. That's really how I dealt with losing my mom. Every time I did artwork when I was a kid, she would take it to work and she would be showing it off to her coworkers and her friends, like, look what my baby did. So me doing art is a way to make my mom proud.
Cheryl was taken away too soon. Her presence during her life was very impactful in our community. And it's been 10 years, and people are still talking about how much they love Cheryl and miss her.
On February 4th, 2010, somewhere in Fallbrook, California, a family of 4 disappeared. Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons, 4-year-old Johnny and 3-year-old Joseph Jr., were suddenly gone. There was no immediate explanation for their absence. There was no clear indication that a violent crime had occurred inside their home. There was no eyewitness who could explain where they had gone. There was no confession, no body, and no obvious murder scene. For the people who knew the McStay family, the disappearance created a question that seemed almost impossible to answer. Where could an entire family simply go? At first, there were reasons to believe that they might have left voluntarily. Joseph and Summer had 2 small children, and there were indications that Mexico had been considered as a possible destination. Searches on the family's computer included information concerning travel to Mexico and documentation that children might need when crossing an international border. Then there was Joseph's Isuzu Trooper, which was eventually found near the United States-Mexico border. Those details gave investigators a possible explanation. Perhaps the McStays had left California. Perhaps they had traveled south. Perhaps they had simply decided to disappear from the lives of the people who knew them. But another detail made that theory difficult for the family members left behind. The McStays' 2 dogs remained at the house. For people who knew the family, the idea that Joseph and Summer would suddenly leave with their 2 young children, while leaving their dogs behind, was difficult to accept. Yet suspicion alone could not answer the central question. In those first days, investigators did not have what would normally transform a disappearance into a homicide investigation. There were no bodies. There was no established murder scene. There was no witness who had seen an attack. There was no confession. The case remained a mystery. And then the mystery lasted not for days or weeks, but for years. More than 3 years passed before the most important discovery in the case was made. On November 11, 2013, a person riding an off-road vehicle in the desert area near Victorville discovered what appeared to be a piece of bone. Authorities were called to the area. What they found changed the nature of the entire investigation. There were 2 shallow graves. Inside were human remains. The missing family had not simply traveled away from Fallbrook. Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr. were dead. They had been buried in the desert, roughly 100 miles from the area where the family had lived. The question that had occupied investigators and relatives for more than 3 years suddenly became something much darker. It was no longer, where did the McStays go? It was, who killed them? The forensic evidence revealed that all 4 had died from blunt force trauma. A 3-pound sledgehammer found in the area of the graves became an important piece of evidence. The injuries described at trial showed the violence inflicted upon the family. Joseph had suffered severe injuries to his skull. Summer had injuries around her jaw. Both children had suffered serious injuries to their skulls. Johnny, only 4 years old, had at least 7 injuries to the head, according to evidence presented at trial. Joseph was also found with electrical wire around his neck. The discovery transformed the McStay case from one of the most perplexing family disappearances in California into a murder investigation involving 4 victims, including 2 very young children. Yet even with the discovery of the bodies, one essential question remained unanswered. Who had done it? Investigators eventually focused on someone who was not a stranger to Joseph McStay. His name was Charles Chase Merritt. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. Their relationship was important because, according to prosecutors, it had developed into a serious financial conflict. Prosecutors argued that Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42.845, and that Joseph was attempting to remove Merritt from the business. After the family disappeared, prosecutors also alleged that Merritt used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks to obtain money. Taken together, those facts became part of the prosecution's theory of motive. The argument was not simply that Merritt had financial problems. It was that Joseph's death could remove a business problem and potentially give Merritt access to money. But motive was only one part of the case. There was no single piece of evidence that, by itself, explained everything. Instead, investigators and prosecutors assembled a chain. Merritt had known Joseph. There had been financial conflict. Merritt's DNA was identified as a contributor to samples from areas around the steering wheel, and Gear shift of Joseph's Isuzu Trooper. His phone was also associated with the area near where the family's remains were eventually found. Financial activity after the disappearance raised additional questions. None of these facts, standing alone, established that Merritt had murdered the family. His relationship with Joseph provided an obvious reason why his DNA could have been present in Joseph's vehicle. Phone location evidence could establish an association with an area, but it was not a recording of someone committing a crime. Financial irregularities could suggest motive or suspicious behavior, but they did not, by themselves, prove murder. That distinction would become one of the central issues of the eventual trial. The prosecution would argue that the pieces had to be considered together. The defense would argue that the pieces did not directly establish guilt. There was no eyewitness who came forward to say that Charles Merritt had killed Joseph. There was no video showing the murders. There was no confession. And the exact location where the 4 people were killed was never established with complete certainty from the information presented here. The sequence of the killings was also not fully reconstructed. How the bodies were transported to the desert remained an important unanswered question. Whether Merritt acted alone or had assistance was another question that could not simply be filled with speculation. Even the reason the 2 children were killed remained partly within the realm of prosecutorial theory. Prosecutors suggested that the children may have been witnesses who could identify the killer, but that explanation was not directly established as a fact about what happened inside the final hours of the family's lives. For more than 3 years, the McStay family had been missing. Their absence had created uncertainty, hope, fear, and unanswered questions. Then, in a remote desert landscape, for graves provided the first definitive answer. The family was dead. But an answer to one question created another, far more difficult one. The investigation that began as a missing person case would eventually lead to a courtroom, where prosecutors would attempt to prove that Charles Chase Merritt was responsible for all 4 deaths. Merritt would deny killing the family and continue to maintain his innocence. The case against him would ultimately depend not on one decisive piece of evidence, but on the combined weight of circumstances, the business relationship, the financial conflict, the vehicle evidence, the phone data, the financial activity, and the discovery of the 4 bodies together in the desert. On June 10, 2019, nearly a decade after the McStays disappeared, a jury found Merritt guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. In January 2020, he received the sentence that followed: death for Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr., and life without the possibility of parole for Joseph. But a conviction, even a conviction carrying the most severe punishment, could not answer every question about the family's final hours. It could not reconstruct every moment. It could not reveal every decision made between the time the family disappeared and the moment their remains were buried. And it could not erase the years in which the people who loved Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. had to live without knowing what had happened to them. That is where the story of the McStay family begins, not with the courtroom, not with the desert graves, and not with the man who would eventually be convicted. It begins with 4 people who were suddenly absent from the lives of everyone who knew them. A husband, a wife, 2 very young children. For people who disappeared together on February 4th, 2010, leaving behind a home, 2 dogs, unanswered questions, and a mystery that would remain unresolved for more than 3 years. And when the truth finally emerged from the California desert, it was not the story of a family that had simply walked away. It was the story of a family whose lives had been violently ended, and of an investigation that would spend years piecing together what could be proven, what could only be argued, and what would remain unknown. Before the name McStay became associated with one of California's most haunting murder cases, Joseph McStay was simply a husband, a father, and a businessman living with his family in Fallbrook, San Diego County. His life was connected to the ordinary responsibilities of family and work. He was married to Summer McStay, and together they were raising 2 young sons. Johnny and Joseph Jr. Johnny was 4 years old. Joseph Jr. was 3. They were still at an age when the world was largely defined by the presence of their parents, by the home they shared, and by the routines of childhood. Nothing in the basic picture of the family suggested that their lives were about to become the center of a disappearance that would remain unresolved for more than 3 years. Joseph's professional life was built around a business involving fountains and decorative water systems. It was through this business that Charles Chase Merritt became an important part of his life. Merritt was not an unknown person who appeared suddenly after the disappearance. He had been Joseph's business partner. That relationship would later become one of the most important elements in the investigation, because prosecutors argued that the business connection between the two men had deteriorated into a serious financial dispute. At first, however, the relationship existed within the ordinary world of business. Joseph and Merritt were connected through their work, and that connection meant that Merritt had a legitimate reason to know Joseph and to have contact with him. This fact would later become important when investigators examined physical evidence associated with Joseph's vehicle. It would also become important when the defense challenged the significance of Merritt's DNA. If two people are business partners, the mere presence of one person's DNA in a vehicle belonging to the other does not automatically establish criminal activity. That would become one of the difficulties prosecutors had to overcome. They could not simply point to Merritt's relationship with Joseph and declare that the relationship itself proved guilt. They needed to show why that relationship mattered and why, in their view, it had developed into a possible motive for murder. According to the prosecution, money was at the center of the conflict. Prosecutors argued that Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42.845, and that Joseph was attempting to remove Merritt from the business. Those allegations became significant because they offered the prosecution a possible explanation for why Joseph might have become a target. The theory was not simply that Merritt was involved in a disagreement over a relatively small amount of money. Prosecutors presented the broader argument that Merritt was facing financial pressure, that Joseph represented an obstacle within their business relationship, and that eliminating Joseph could potentially solve problems that Merritt was facing. Later, financial activity following the family's disappearance would become another part of that theory. Prosecutors alleged that Merritt used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks to obtain money. After the family had disappeared, those allegations would eventually be presented as evidence that Merritt had both a financial motive and an opportunity to benefit after Joseph was gone. But at this stage, before the family disappeared, there was no murder investigation. There was no reason for the McStay household to be viewed as the center of a future homicide case. Joseph was living with Summer and their 2 young children in Fallbrook. The family was a unit of 4. Their ages alone make the later disappearance especially difficult to comprehend. Johnny was only 4. Joseph Jr. was 3. Whatever the eventual circumstances of their deaths, these were 2 children who depended entirely upon their parents. They disappeared at the same time as their mother and father, and that fact would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. When an adult disappears, investigators may consider a wide range of possibilities. Adults can leave voluntarily. They can travel without informing others. They can make personal decisions that appear inexplicable to people around them. But when 2 very young children disappear with their parents, the possibilities become more complicated. Their disappearance raised questions about whether the entire family had left together, whether something had happened to them, or whether the circumstances surrounding their absence were being misunderstood. The first major clue seemed to support the possibility that the family had traveled. Joseph's Isuzu Trooper was eventually found near the United States-Mexico border. That discovery became important because there was also information on the family's computer concerning travel to Mexico. Among the searches were questions about documentation needed for children traveling across the border. To investigators, those details provided a possible explanation for the family's disappearance. Perhaps they had gone to Mexico, Perhaps they had intended to travel outside the United States. The presence of the vehicle near the border made that possibility difficult to ignore. Yet the family members left behind had reasons to question whether such a journey made sense. One of the most striking details was that the family's 2 dogs remained at the home. The dogs were not taken along. No arrangement for their care was part of the information available in the case, as presented here. For relatives trying to understand what had happened, this was another detail that complicated the theory that Joseph and Summer had simply decided to leave. It did not prove that they had been harmed, but it was difficult to reconcile with the idea of an ordinary family trip, particularly when 2 very young children were involved. The disappearance therefore occupied an uncomfortable space between 2 possibilities. On one side was the evidence suggesting that the family might have traveled, the computer searches concerning Mexico, and the discovery of Joseph's vehicle near the border. On the other side were the circumstances that made a sudden voluntary departure difficult to understand: the young children, the abandoned dogs, and the absence of a clear explanation to the people who knew them. The home itself did little to resolve the uncertainty. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. There was no obvious scene of a violent struggle. The environment did not immediately tell investigators that 4 people had been murdered. Some food remained in the house, and the dogs were still there. These details mattered because they shaped the initial direction of the investigation. Without bodies, without a clear crime scene, and without an eyewitness, there was no straightforward path to reconstructing what had happened. The McStay family had simply disappeared. The absence of physical evidence created an enormous gap between suspicion and proof. That gap would remain for years. During that period, Joseph's relationship with Charles Merritt existed in a different context. Merritt was not initially presented as a stranger lurking around the family. He was a person connected to Joseph through business. But when investigators later examined the family's disappearance as a possible homicide, that business relationship became increasingly important. The financial dispute offered prosecutors a possible motive. The later allegations involving business accounts offered another piece of the developing theory. Yet motive alone could not establish who had killed the family. The investigation would ultimately need to move beyond the question of who had a reason to be angry or financially motivated and toward the much more difficult question of who could be connected to the physical evidence. That evidence would not appear all at once. It would emerge gradually, and some of it would remain open to competing interpretations. The family's vehicle, the financial records, phone location information, and eventually the burial site would become pieces of a much larger picture. But none of that was visible on the day the McStay family disappeared. At that moment, there were only 4 missing people: Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. There was a home in Fallbrook that no longer contained a family who had lived there. There were 2 dogs left behind. There was an Isuzu Trooper discovered near the border. There were searches suggesting that Mexico might have been considered as a destination. And there was a family business in which Joseph had been working with Charles Merritt. The significance of those details would only become clear much later. For the people trying to understand the disappearance, however, the central reality was painfully simple. Joseph McStay had vanished. Summer McStay had vanished. Their 4-year-old son Johnny had vanished. Their 3-year-old son Joseph Jr. had vanished. There was no explanation that could be proven. And as the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, the absence of 4 people who had once occupied an ordinary family home in Fallbrook became an increasingly difficult mystery to solve. The answers would eventually lead investigators far away from that home, into the California desert. But before the graves were discovered, before forensic evidence transformed the case, and before Charles Merritt stood accused in court, the McStays were still a missing family. Their disappearance had not yet become a murder case, and the people searching for them did not yet know that the lives of 4 members of the same family had already ended. February 4th, 2010, would eventually become the date associated with the disappearance of the McStay family. But on that day, there was no confirmed murder investigation, no known burial site, and no evidence that could immediately explain where Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons had gone. There was only an absence, for members of the same family were suddenly no longer where they were expected to be. Joseph was around 40 years old. Summer was around 43. Their sons, Johnny and Joseph Jr., were only 4 and 3. Whatever had happened, it had happened to an entire family at once. The circumstances surrounding their disappearance were unusual precisely because the home did not immediately present itself as the scene of a violent crime. There was no obvious evidence of forced entry. There was no clear indication of a major struggle. There was no obvious scene that told investigators someone had attacked the family inside the house. Instead, the circumstances suggested something much less dramatic on the surface. A family had apparently left. That possibility became one of the earliest explanations investigators had to consider. If Joseph and Summer had simply decided to travel, perhaps with their children, then their absence could have an ordinary explanation. But if they had not left voluntarily, then the lack of an obvious crime scene created an enormous problem. There was little physical evidence available to explain what had happened. Some food remained in the house. The family's 2 dogs remained there as well. Those dogs became an important detail because they complicated the idea that the McStays had simply packed up and left for an extended trip. The family had 2 very young children. If Joseph and Summer were preparing to leave for a substantial journey, especially one involving travel outside the United States, it would be reasonable to expect some arrangement concerning the animals. Yet the dogs were left behind. That did not prove that the family had been harmed, but it created another unanswered question. Why would a family disappear while leaving their pets behind? Another clue pointed investigators in a different direction. Joseph's Isuzu Trooper was eventually found near the United States-Mexico border. The location of the vehicle mattered because investigators also found information on the family's computer concerning travel to Mexico. Some of the searches involved documentation that children might need when crossing the border. These searches offered a possible explanation for the family's disappearance. Perhaps Joseph and Summer had intended to travel to Mexico with their sons. Perhaps the vehicle had been driven toward the border as part of such a trip. In the early stages, that possibility could not simply be dismissed. Investigators had to consider what the available evidence suggested, and the available evidence included both the vehicle and the computer searches. For the family members who were left waiting for answers, however, the Mexico theory was difficult to accept. The disappearance of 4 people, including 2 small children, without a clear explanation was already unusual. The fact that the dogs remained at the home added to the uncertainty. If the family had traveled, why had they left without making arrangements for the dogs? If they had not traveled, then why was Joseph's vehicle found near the border? Each answer seemed to create another question. The investigation therefore existed in a state of uncertainty. There was no body to establish that a crime had occurred. There was no clear murder scene. There was no eyewitness to an attack. There was no confession. Without those things, investigators could not simply reconstruct a homicide from the beginning. The case was treated as a disappearance, and that distinction was significant. A missing family could have left voluntarily. They could have traveled. They could have encountered an accident. They could have gone somewhere without informing relatives. There were possibilities, but there was no definitive explanation. As the days passed, the absence of the McStay family became more difficult to understand. For people had disappeared together, and there was no clear account of where they had gone. The computer searches concerning Mexico became part of the broader picture, as did the location of the Isuzu Trooper. Yet the absence of the family from their home remained unexplained. There was also another element of the case that would eventually become central: Joseph's business relationship with Charles Chase Merritt. At the time of the disappearance, Merritt was not simply an unknown person with no connection to Joseph. He had been Joseph's business partner. Their business involved fountains and decorative water systems, and according to prosecutors, the relationship had developed into a serious financial dispute. Prosecutors later argued that Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42.845, and that Joseph was attempting to remove Merritt from the business. Those allegations would eventually become part of the prosecution's theory of motive. But it is important to separate what investigators knew at different stages of the case from what prosecutors would later argue in court. At the time the family disappeared, the full significance of the business relationship had not yet been established as part of a proven murder theory. The family was missing, and investigators were still searching for an explanation. Merritt's relationship with Joseph meant that he would later become relevant to the investigation. But suspicion did not automatically provide an answer. The same principle applied to the financial issues. A business dispute could explain tension between two people, but it could not, by itself, explain the disappearance of 4 members of a family. The investigation would eventually have to establish more than a possible motive. It would need evidence connecting a particular person to the disappearance and, ultimately, to the deaths. That evidence would come slowly. Years later, investigators would examine DNA from Joseph's Isuzu Trooper. They would examine phone location information. They would investigate financial activity after the disappearance. But on February 4, 2010, none of those pieces had yet formed the chain that would eventually be presented to a jury. There was simply a family that had disappeared. One of the most important features of the case was the absence of immediate physical evidence. When investigators have a body, they have a starting point. When they have a murder scene, they can examine blood, fingerprints, weapons, signs of entry, and other evidence. In the McStay case, those answers did not exist at the beginning. The family had disappeared without leaving behind a clearly identifiable homicide scene. That absence would allow the possibility of voluntary travel to remain part of the investigation. It also meant that the case could remain unresolved for an extraordinary length of time. The mystery would continue for more than 3 years. During that period, the question of what happened to Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. remained open. Had they crossed into Mexico? Had they gone somewhere else? Had they simply chosen to disappear from their former lives? Or had something happened to them that no one had yet discovered? The discovery that eventually answered those questions would occur far from the McStay home. It would happen in the California desert near Victorville, where 4 people would eventually be found buried in 2 shallow graves. But that discovery was still years away. On February 4, 2010, there was no desert grave to examine and no forensic evidence to reveal how the family had died. There was only a disappearance that seemed impossible to explain. The Isuzu Trooper near the border suggested one possibility. The computer searches concerning Mexico suggested another piece of the same possibility. The abandoned dogs pointed in a different direction. The absence of forced entry raised further questions. And the lack of a clear crime scene left investigators without a definitive starting point. For lives had suddenly become 4 unanswered questions. Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, Joseph Jr. The family had vanished together, and for those left behind, the most basic question was also the most difficult. Were they somewhere alive? Or had something terrible happened to all 4 of them? For more than 3 years, that question would remain unanswered. And when the answer finally came, it would reveal that the apparent departure of a family had been something entirely different. The McStays had not simply disappeared from California. They had disappeared into a mystery that would eventually lead investigators to a remote burial site, a collection of forensic evidence, and a man who had once been connected to Joseph through business. But in February 2010, none of that was known. There was only the silence left behind by 4 missing members of one family. For more than 3 years, the disappearance of the McStay family remained a mystery without a definitive ending. Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, and their 2 young sons had vanished together, leaving behind a home that did not immediately reveal a violent crime, 2 dogs that remained behind, and a vehicle that was eventually found near the United States-Mexico border. The available evidence initially allowed investigators to consider the possibility that the family had traveled, particularly because searches on their computer included information concerning Mexico and documentation required for children crossing an international border. But the longer the family remained missing, the more difficult it became to explain their disappearance as an ordinary departure. The case contained too many unanswered questions, and eventually investigators began examining the people who had connections to Joseph McStay. Among those people was Charles Chase Merritt, Joseph's business partner. Merritt's significance to the investigation did not begin with a confession or an eyewitness account. It developed through the relationship he had with Joseph and through financial circumstances that prosecutors would later describe as a possible motive. Joseph's business involved fountains and decorative water systems, and Merritt had worked with him in that business. Because they were business partners, Merritt was not someone who had appeared unexpectedly in Joseph's life after the disappearance. He was already part of Joseph's professional world. That relationship became increasingly important when investigators examined the financial circumstances surrounding the disappearance. According to prosecutors, Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42,845. Prosecutors also argued that Joseph was attempting to remove Merritt from the business. If that account was correct, the two men were no longer simply business associates operating without conflict. There was a financial dispute between them, and Joseph was allegedly taking steps that could have affected Merritt's position in the business. This became one of the central foundations of the prosecution's theory. The prosecution would eventually argue that money and business problems provided Merritt with a reason to want Joseph out of the way. But at this stage, the distinction between motive and proof was critical. A financial dispute could provide a possible motive, but it could not establish that a murder had occurred or that Merritt had committed it. Investigators needed more. The disappearance itself also created another question. If Joseph had been the intended target of a financial dispute, why had Summer and the two children disappeared with him? Later, prosecutors would suggest that the children may have been killed because they could have witnessed or identified the person responsible. But that explanation remained a prosecution theory rather than a directly established account of what happened during the family's final hours. The investigation, therefore, had to proceed through evidence rather than assumptions. One area that eventually became important was Joseph's Isuzu Trooper. The vehicle had already attracted attention because it was found near the border. After the family was discovered to have been murdered, investigators revisited the vehicle as part of the larger case. DNA associated with Charles Merritt was identified as a contributor to samples from areas around the steering wheel and gear shift. To prosecutors, this was significant. To the defense, however, the same evidence had another possible explanation. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. He had a legitimate relationship with Joseph, and therefore a legitimate reason to have been in Joseph's vehicle. The presence of Merritt's DNA did not, by itself, establish that he had used the vehicle to transport the family or their bodies. This distinction would become important when the case eventually reached trial. The prosecution could use the DNA as one part of a larger chain, but the defense could argue that the evidence had an innocent explanation. The investigation also examined Merritt's phone data. Prosecutors presented evidence that Merritt's phone had been associated with an area near the eventual burial site. That location was important because the graves were found in the desert near Victorville, far from the family's home in Fallbrook. The prosecution argued that the phone evidence connected Merritt to the area where the bodies were buried. Again, however, the evidence was circumstantial. Phone location information was not a recording of Merritt committing a crime. It did not show a person digging a grave, carrying a body, or striking anyone. It provided an indication that prosecutors believed was meaningful when considered together with the other evidence. This became a recurring pattern in the McStay investigation. There was no single piece of evidence that explained the entire crime. Instead, investigators accumulated separate pieces that, when combined, could be interpreted as a larger story. The financial evidence became another important part of that story. Prosecutors alleged that after the family disappeared, Merritt used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks to obtain money. If true, these transactions could be interpreted as more than ordinary financial activity. They could suggest that Merritt was attempting to benefit from Joseph's absence. For prosecutors, this helped connect the financial dispute before the disappearance with financial behavior afterward. The theory became increasingly coherent from their perspective. Merritt allegedly had a financial conflict with Joseph. Joseph disappeared. And afterward, Merritt allegedly engaged in financial activity involving Joseph's business accounts. Yet even here, the same question remained. Did suspicious financial activity prove that Merritt had killed for people? The defense would argue that it did not. The prosecution's case, therefore, depended on accumulation. Each piece had to be evaluated in relation to the others. The business relationship explained why Merritt knew Joseph. The alleged debt and dispute supplied a possible motive. The financial activity after the disappearance suggested a possible benefit. The DNA in the vehicle connected Merritt physically to a vehicle belonging to Joseph. The phone data potentially connected Merritt to the region where the bodies were eventually found. But none of those pieces, considered individually, showed the entire crime. That was why the discovery of the bodies in November 2013 became such an important turning point. Until then, investigators did not know whether Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. were dead. Once their remains were found, the disappearance could be reconstructed as a homicide investigation. The forensic evidence showed that all four had died from blunt force trauma. A 3-pound sledgehammer was found at the burial area. Joseph had severe skull injuries. Summer had injuries around her jaw. And both children had severe injuries to their skulls. Johnny had at least 7 head injuries according to evidence presented at trial. Joseph was also found with electrical wire around his neck. These findings established the violence involved, but they did not automatically identify the killer. Investigators still had to determine who could be connected to the deaths. The desert graves provided a location where the bodies had been left, but they did not necessarily establish where the murders themselves had occurred. That distinction left an important gap in the reconstruction of the crime. The precise location of the killings was not established from the information available here, nor was every step involved in transporting the bodies to the desert definitively reconstructed. What investigators did have was a growing collection of evidence that could be compared against the people connected to Joseph. Merritt stood out because his relationship with Joseph intersected several elements of the case. He was connected to Joseph through business. Prosecutors alleged a significant financial dispute. His DNA appeared in Joseph's vehicle. His phone was associated with the area near the burial site. And prosecutors alleged financial transactions involving Joseph's business after the family disappeared. These facts did not exist in isolation anymore. They were becoming part of a narrative that prosecutors would eventually present to a jury. At the same time, the absence of direct evidence remained significant. No eyewitness had seen Merritt kill Joseph. No eyewitness had seen him kill Summer. No eyewitness had seen him kill the children. There was no confession. There was no direct video. There was no complete reconstruction of the crime that showed exactly how the family had been killed and transported to the desert. This meant the investigation had to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. For Merritt, the investigation was moving toward a point where his relationship with Joseph would no longer be viewed simply as a business connection. It was becoming one of the central elements of a murder case. The disappearance had begun with uncertainty about whether the family had voluntarily traveled. The discovery of the graves had established that they had been murdered. The forensic findings had revealed the violence that killed them. And now investigators were examining the connections between the victims and the people who might have had a reason to harm them. Among those connections, Charles Chase Merritt's relationship with Joseph stood out. But suspicion was not yet conviction. The case still required investigators to bridge the distance between possible motive and actual responsibility. That bridge would be built from evidence collected over time. And the more investigators examined the McStay family's disappearance, the more the case began to revolve around a single question. Could the separate pieces of evidence surrounding Charles Merritt be strong enough, when considered together, to establish that he was responsible for the deaths of all 4 members of the McStay family? For more than 3 years, the disappearance of the McStay family remained a question without a body, without a confirmed crime scene, and without a definitive explanation. Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young sons had vanished in February 2010. The early clues had pointed investigators in several directions. Their computer contained searches connected to travel to Mexico. Joseph's Isuzu Trooper was eventually found near the United States-Mexico border. Their 2 dogs remained behind at the family home. None of these details could establish what had happened. The case remained a disappearance. Then, on November 11, 2013, everything changed. A person riding an off-road vehicle in the desert near Victorville, in San Bernardino County, discovered what appeared to be a piece of bone. It was a small discovery in a vast landscape, but it would become the turning point in the entire case. Authorities responded to the location. What they found was far more significant than a single piece of bone. There were 2 shallow graves. Inside them were human remains. The discovery immediately transformed the nature of the investigation. For more than 3 years, investigators had been asking where the McStays might have gone. Now they had a possible answer, and it was the answer no one had wanted. The family had not simply traveled away. They had not disappeared into another country. They were in California, beneath the desert ground. 4 sets of remains were eventually identified as Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr. The 4 members of the family had been together in death, just as they had disappeared together in life. The discovery also changed the central question facing investigators. The case was no longer primarily about locating missing people. It was about determining how they had died, where they had been killed, who had killed them, and why. The distance between the family's home in Fallbrook and the burial location near Victorville added another layer of complexity. The bodies had been transported away from the place where the family had lived. Yet the discovery of the graves did not automatically establish the exact location of the murders. It showed where the bodies had ultimately been left. That distinction would remain important because investigators still had to reconstruct the sequence of events between the family's disappearance and their burial in the desert. The forensic evidence began to answer some questions while creating others. The 4 deaths were determined to have resulted from blunt force trauma. This was not a case in which the cause of death could remain uncertain. The injuries indicated severe physical violence. A 3-pound sledgehammer found at the burial site became an especially important piece of evidence. The weapon offered investigators a possible connection to the blunt force injuries, although the existence of the hammer did not, by itself, establish who had used it. The remains also revealed the severity of the injuries suffered by individual members of the family. Joseph had suffered serious damage to his skull. Summer had injuries around her jaw. Both children had significant injuries to their skulls. Johnny, only 4 years old, had sustained at least 7 injuries to the head, according to evidence presented during the later trial. Joseph was also found with electrical wire around his neck. These findings made the reality of the crime impossible to ignore, for people had died violently. 2 of them were children, and they had been buried in shallow graves in a remote desert area. The discovery of Johnny's injuries was particularly difficult to reconcile with any theory that treated the disappearance as an ordinary family departure. He was 4 years old. Joseph Jr. was 3. Whatever had happened, it had happened to children who were entirely dependent on the adults around them. The forensic evidence did not explain why the children had been killed. That question remained one of the most painful uncertainties in the investigation. Prosecutors later suggested that the children may have witnessed the killer or been able to identify the person responsible. That possibility became part of the prosecution's theory, but it was not directly established as a fact about the family's final moments. The evidence could show injuries and cause of death. It could not tell investigators every thought or decision that had occurred before those injuries were inflicted. The discovery also forced investigators to reconsider the earlier evidence. The Isuzu Trooper, once viewed in the context of a possible trip to Mexico, now became part of a potential homicide investigation. If the family had been murdered, why had their vehicle been found near the border? Had it been driven there after the disappearance? Who had been inside it? How had it become connected to the family's final movements? These questions became more significant because investigators could now examine the vehicle for evidence associated with the deaths. DNA associated with Charles Chase Merritt was later identified as a contributor to samples from areas around the steering wheel and gear shift. This became important to the prosecution because Merritt had already been identified as a person connected to Joseph through their business relationship. Yet the DNA evidence was not simple. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. His relationship with Joseph gave him a legitimate reason to have been in the vehicle. Therefore, the presence of his DNA could not automatically prove that he had used the vehicle to transport the family or their remains. The defense would later emphasize precisely this point. The prosecution needed to show that the DNA was meaningful when considered alongside the rest of the evidence. The burial discovery also brought renewed attention to Merritt's phone data. Prosecutors presented evidence that Merritt's phone had been associated with the area near the burial site. Again, the significance depended on context. A phone's presence in an area does not show what its owner was physically doing at every moment. It does not record a burial. It does not show an attack. It does not identify a weapon. But if prosecutors could establish that the phone's location was consistent with the movements required to transport and bury 4 bodies, they could argue that it strengthened the larger chain of circumstantial evidence. The financial evidence also became more significant after the discovery. According to prosecutors, Merritt had a substantial financial conflict with Joseph. They argued that he owed Joseph approximately $42.845 and that Joseph was attempting to remove him from the business. Prosecutors further alleged that after the family disappeared, Merritt used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks to obtain money. The discovery of the bodies, therefore, did not create the financial theory. It gave that theory a much darker context. Before the graves were found, a disputed business relationship was simply a financial issue. After the graves were found, investigators had to consider whether that conflict could have been connected to 4 deaths. Still, investigators faced the same fundamental challenge. There was no direct eyewitness account of the killings. No one came forward to describe what happened to Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. There was no confession from Merritt. There was no video of the murders. There was no established crime scene inside the McStay home that could provide a complete forensic reconstruction. The desert graves answered the question of whether the family had died, but they did not answer every question about how the deaths had occurred. The location of the killings remained uncertain. The precise sequence of the deaths remained uncertain. The identity of anyone who might have assisted Merritt, if anyone did, was not established by the information presented here. Even the explanation for why the 2 children were killed remained a matter of prosecutorial theory, rather than a proven account of the family's final moments. What the discovery did establish was the most devastating fact of the entire case. The McStay family had not voluntarily disappeared. Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. had been murdered and buried. Their disappearance had lasted more than 3 years because the physical evidence had been hidden beneath the desert ground. Now that evidence had been found, and the investigation entered a new phase. Investigators no longer had to search for a missing family whose fate was unknown. They had 4 victims, a burial site, forensic evidence, a possible weapon, and a growing list of questions about the people connected to Joseph McStay. Charles Chase Merritt was becoming increasingly important to those questions. But the case against him would still have to be constructed piece by piece. The discovery of the graves had revealed the crime. It had not yet revealed the entire story of who committed it. And that distinction would define the investigation that followed. The discovery of the McStay family's remains in November 2013 transformed the investigation. But it did not immediately provide investigators with a complete explanation of the crime. For victims had been identified. Their deaths had been violent. 2 shallow graves had been found in the desert near Victorville. A 3-pound sledgehammer had been recovered from the burial area. Yet the central question remained unanswered. Who was responsible for the deaths of Joseph McStay? Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr.? The investigation now had to work backward. Instead of asking where the family had gone, investigators had to examine the evidence surrounding their disappearance, their vehicle, their finances, and the people who had connections to Joseph. Among those people, Charles Chase Merritt increasingly stood out. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. Their professional relationship was not merely a casual acquaintance. They were connected through the business involving fountains and decorative water systems, which meant Merritt had a legitimate reason to know Joseph, communicate with him, and have contact with his property. But prosecutors argued that the business relationship had deteriorated into a serious financial conflict. According to the prosecution, Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42,845, while Joseph was attempting to remove Merritt from the business. That allegation became an important part of the prosecution's theory of motive. If Merritt was under financial pressure and faced losing his position in the business, prosecutors argued that Joseph's continued presence represented a problem. But investigators still needed evidence connecting Merritt to the physical circumstances surrounding the murders. One of the most important areas of examination was Joseph's Isuzu Trooper. The vehicle had already been significant during the early disappearance investigation because it was found near the United States-Mexico border. At first, its location had contributed to the possibility that the family had traveled toward Mexico. Once the remains were found, however, the vehicle had to be viewed through a different lens. Investigators examined the vehicle for evidence that might connect people to it. DNA associated with Charles Merritt was identified as a contributor to samples from areas around the steering wheel and gear shift. For prosecutors, this was important because the vehicle was associated with Joseph and with the family's movements before their disappearance. But DNA evidence presented a limitation as well. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. His presence in the vehicle was not inherently suspicious. The defense could argue that there was an ordinary explanation for his DNA being present. It was therefore not enough to say that Merritt's DNA existed in the vehicle. Prosecutors had to explain why that DNA mattered when combined with the other evidence. The investigation also turned toward phone data. Prosecutors presented evidence that Merritt's phone had been associated with an area near the location where the McStay family was buried. The geographical significance of that information was considerable. The burial site was in the desert near Victorville, roughly 100 miles from the area where the family had lived. Merritt's phone, being associated with the area, therefore, became another piece of the developing case. Yet phone location evidence had limitations of its own. It was not a photograph of Merritt at the graves. It did not show him digging. It did not show him transporting the bodies. It did not record the murders. It indicated an association between his phone and a particular geographic area. The prosecution's argument depended on combining that information with everything else investigators had learned. The same pattern appeared in the financial investigation. Prosecutors alleged that after the McStay family disappeared, Merritt used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks to obtain money. Those allegations gave the financial evidence a significance beyond the original dispute. If Merritt had a financial conflict with Joseph before the disappearance and then allegedly accessed Joseph's business funds afterward, prosecutors could argue that the two events were connected. The theory was that Merritt had both a reason to eliminate Joseph and a financial benefit to gain from his absence. But once again, financial irregularities did not directly establish murder. A person could commit financial crimes without killing anyone. The prosecution, therefore, had to establish a broader chain in which motive, opportunity, physical evidence, location data, and post-disappearance conduct reinforced one another. Another detail investigators noticed concerned the way Merritt referred to Joseph after the family had disappeared. During an interview with investigators, Merritt referred to Joseph as someone who had been his close friend, using the past tense. The wording attracted attention because Joseph was still considered missing at the time. Yet this detail had to be treated carefully. A person's choice of tense is not proof of murder. It could reflect many things. But within the context of the investigation, it became another small piece of information that investigators considered alongside the more substantial evidence. The case was gradually becoming one built from accumulation rather than a single decisive discovery. The graves established that the family had been murdered. The forensic evidence established blunt force trauma as the cause of death. The sledgehammer provided investigators with a possible weapon. The vehicle provided DNA evidence. Phone records potentially placed Merritt in the general area of the burial site. Financial records provided evidence of a possible motive and alleged financial conduct after the disappearance. His relationship with Joseph explained why Merritt was connected to the family in the first place. But the absence of direct evidence remained a central problem. Investigators did not have a witness who could describe the murders. They did not have a video showing Merritt killing the family. They did not have a confession. They did not have a clearly established murder scene inside the McStay home. They did not have a complete forensic reconstruction showing exactly where Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. were killed. This meant that every piece of evidence had to be evaluated carefully. The defense would eventually emphasize those gaps. The prosecution would argue that the gaps did not matter because a case can be proven through circumstantial evidence. In a circumstantial case, the question is not whether one piece of evidence independently proves guilt. It is whether all the evidence, taken together, points convincingly toward one conclusion. That would become the central battle of the eventual trial. Before reaching that courtroom, however, investigators had to decide whether the evidence was strong enough to move against Merritt. The financial relationship between Merritt and Joseph was particularly important because it provided a possible explanation for why Joseph might have been targeted. Prosecutors alleged that Merritt's financial position was deteriorating and that Joseph intended to remove him from their business relationship. The alleged debt of approximately $42,845 became one of the specific numbers associated with the dispute. Investigators also examined what happened financially after the family disappeared. According to prosecutors, Merritt's alleged use of Joseph's accounts and forged checks suggested that he was attempting to access money connected to the business. This behavior, prosecutors argued, was consistent with someone who expected to benefit from Joseph's absence. The defense, however, maintained that the financial evidence did not prove homicide. The distinction between suspicious conduct and proof of murder would remain important throughout the case. As the investigation progressed, the picture of Merritt became increasingly complicated. He was not simply a stranger whose phone happened to appear near a burial site. He was someone who had known Joseph professionally. He was connected to the business. He had a reported financial dispute with Joseph. His DNA was identified in Joseph's vehicle. His phone was associated with the region near the graves, and prosecutors alleged suspicious financial activity following the disappearance. At the same time, each fact had a possible limitation or alternative interpretation. His relationship with Joseph could explain the DNA. Phone data did not directly show criminal conduct. Financial transactions did not necessarily establish murder. The case therefore required investigators to look at the evidence as a whole. The question was becoming whether these individual facts were independent coincidences or interconnected pieces of the same crime. That distinction would eventually be placed before a jury. For now, investigators were still building the case. The discovery in the desert had answered the most painful question: what had happened to the family? But the investigation still had to establish responsibility. For people had been killed, and someone had transported their bodies into the desert and buried them. The evidence increasingly pointed investigators toward Charles Merritt. But pointing toward a suspect was not the same as proving guilt. The next stage would involve turning the investigation into a criminal case, examining Merritt's actions more closely, and determining whether the accumulated evidence could support an arrest and eventually a prosecution. On November 5, 2014, nearly 1 year after the family's remains were discovered, Charles Chase Merritt was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. By then, the investigation had moved far beyond the original mystery of a family who appeared to have vanished. The case had become a homicide prosecution built around a chain of circumstances. The question was no longer simply where the McStays had gone. It was whether the evidence gathered over the years could prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Charles Merritt was responsible for all 4 deaths. By the time Charles Chase Merritt was arrested on November 5, 2014, the investigation into the McStay family's disappearance had already undergone a profound transformation. For more than 3 years, Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr. had been missing. Then, in November 2013, their remains were discovered in 2 shallow graves in the desert near Victorville. The discovery established that the family had not simply left California. They had been killed. It also gave investigators the physical evidence they had been missing for years. But finding the victims did not automatically identify the person responsible. The investigation now had to connect the deaths to a specific suspect. Charles Merritt became that suspect, and prosecutors would eventually build their case around a combination of financial motive, physical evidence, phone data, and Merritt's relationship with Joseph. The arrest did not occur immediately after the graves were discovered. Investigators continued examining the evidence for approximately another year before Merritt was taken into custody. That passage of time reflected the nature of the case. There was no confession that could resolve the investigation. There was no eyewitness who could provide a direct account of the killings. The case depended on separate pieces of evidence that had to be examined together. Merritt's relationship with Joseph was one of the first pieces. He had been Joseph's business partner in the fountain and decorative water system business. That connection meant Merritt had a legitimate reason to know Joseph and to have access to aspects of his professional life. But according to prosecutors, the relationship had become strained because of money. They argued that Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42.45, and that Joseph was trying to remove him from the business. This alleged dispute formed the basis of the prosecution's proposed motive. Prosecutors argued that Merritt faced financial pressure and that Joseph represented an obstacle to his financial interests. The theory became darker after investigators examined what happened to Joseph's business accounts. Following the family's disappearance, prosecutors alleged that Merritt used those accounts and forged checks to obtain money. If accepted as evidence of his conduct, those transactions suggested that Merritt may have benefited financially after Joseph disappeared. The prosecution would eventually argue that this behavior was not separate from the murder case, but part of the same financial story. However, the defense would challenge that interpretation. Suspicious financial activity, even if proven, does not automatically establish that the person involved murdered 4 people. The prosecution therefore needed to connect the financial circumstances with the physical evidence. One of the most important pieces was DNA from Joseph's Isuzu Trooper. The vehicle had already played a role in the early disappearance investigation because it was found near the United States-Mexico border. At the time, that discovery had supported the possibility that the McStay family had traveled toward Mexico. After the discovery of the bodies, however, the vehicle took on a different significance. Investigators examined evidence associated with it, and DNA belonging to Charles Merritt was identified as a contributor in samples from areas around the steering wheel and gear shift. For prosecutors, this was an important connection between Merritt and the vehicle. But the defense had a straightforward response. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. There was nothing inherently impossible about his DNA being present in Joseph's vehicle. The DNA could establish contact, but it did not independently establish murder. That limitation was central to the case. Prosecutors could not rely on one piece of evidence. They had to demonstrate that the DNA became meaningful when considered alongside the other. Circumstances. Phone data provided another potential connection. Prosecutors presented evidence that Merritt's phone had been associated with an area near the location where the McStay family was buried. The burial site was in the desert near Victorville, far from the family's home in Fallbrook. For prosecutors, Merritt's phone being associated with that region was significant because the bodies had been transported and buried there. Yet the phone evidence also had limitations. It did not show Merritt physically standing beside the graves. It did not capture the act of burial. It did not show him transporting the bodies. It was circumstantial evidence that had to be interpreted in relation to other evidence. The same was true of the financial records. Each piece could be explained independently. The prosecution's argument depended on the idea that the pieces reinforced one another. Merritt had a business relationship with Joseph. That relationship allegedly involved a significant financial dispute. Merritt's DNA appeared in Joseph's vehicle. His phone was associated with the region where the bodies were found. Prosecutors alleged that he engaged in questionable financial activity involving Joseph's business. After the disappearance, when combined, prosecutors argued, these facts pointed toward Merritt's responsibility for the murders. Another detail that investigators considered was Merritt's language when discussing Joseph after the disappearance. In an interview with investigators, Merritt referred to Joseph as someone who had been his close friend. The past tense wording drew attention because Joseph was still considered missing at the time. Yet even this detail had to be understood within its limits. It was not a confession. It was not direct evidence of murder. It was simply one observation made during the investigation. The case against Merritt was therefore becoming a mosaic. No single tile showed the whole picture. The significance lay in the image investigators believed appeared when the pieces were placed together. The remains of the family showed that a violent crime had occurred. The forensic evidence showed blunt force trauma. The sledgehammer found at the burial site provided a possible weapon. The vehicle provided DNA evidence. Phone data potentially connected Merritt to the area of the graves. Financial evidence supplied a possible motive and suggested alleged financial activity after Joseph's disappearance. And the business relationship explained why Merritt had been connected to Joseph in the first place. Yet important questions remained unanswered. Investigators could not publicly present a direct eyewitness account of the murders because none existed in the information available here. They could not point to a confession because Merritt denied responsibility. They could not show a video of the killings. They also did not have a definitive account of where the family had been murdered. The graves established where the bodies had been buried, but not necessarily where the fatal attacks occurred. Nor was every detail of how the 4 bodies were transported into the desert definitively established. These gaps would later become central to the defense. Merritt maintained that he was innocent. He denied killing Joseph, Summer, Johnny, or Joseph Jr. The prosecution, however, believed that the accumulated evidence was strong enough to establish responsibility. The arrest on November 5, 2014, marked the point at which the investigation became a formal criminal case against a named suspect. For murder charges were brought against Merritt. The man who had once been connected to Joseph through business was now accused of killing Joseph and his entire family. The contrast was striking. Before the disappearance, Merritt had been a business associate. After the discovery of the graves, he became the central figure in a murder investigation. The years between the disappearance and the arrest had produced a transformation in how investigators understood the case. What had first looked like a possible voluntary journey had become a homicide. What had once been an unexplained business relationship had become a possible motive. What had once been a vehicle near the Mexican border had become a source of forensic evidence. What had once been an ordinary phone record had become part of an argument about merits, movements, and what had once been financial activity was now being examined for signs of a possible benefit from Joseph's disappearance. But an arrest was not a conviction. The evidence would have to withstand scrutiny in court. Merritt would have the opportunity to challenge every part of the prosecution's theory. His lawyers could argue that the DNA had an innocent explanation, that phone data did not prove physical presence at the graves, and that financial irregularities did not prove murder. They could also emphasize the most obvious weakness in any circumstantial case. No one had seen Merritt commit the killings. The prosecution would respond that murder cases do not always come with eyewitnesses or confessions. They would argue that the jury could reach a conclusion from the combined weight of circumstantial evidence. That argument would eventually become the foundation of the trial. But before the jury could hear it, the case would have to move through the legal process. Merritt's arrest was therefore not the end of the McStay investigation. It was the beginning of its most consequential stage. The question had changed once again. Investigators had spent years asking what had happened to the McStay family. They now believed they knew who was responsible. The next challenge was far more demanding, proving it in court beyond a reasonable doubt. After Charles Chase Merritt was arrested on November 5, 2014, the McStay family case entered a new and more complicated stage. For years, investigators had been trying to determine what had happened to Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr. The discovery of their remains had answered the most devastating question. The family had been murdered. Merritt's arrest provided investigators with a specific person to accuse. But an accusation was not the same thing as proof. And the case against Merritt would ultimately depend almost entirely on how a jury interpreted a collection of circumstantial evidence. There was no eyewitness who had seen Merritt kill Joseph. There was no eyewitness who had seen him attack Summer. There was no witness who had described him harming either of the two children. There was no confession. There was no video recording of the murders. The prosecution, therefore, had to construct its case from evidence that, taken separately, could have alternative explanations. The central question was whether those pieces became convincing when considered together. The prosecution's theory began with Joseph and Merritt's business relationship. Joseph had operated a business involving fountains and decorative water systems, and Merritt had been his business partner. According to prosecutors, their relationship had deteriorated because of money. They alleged that Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42.845, and that Joseph was attempting to remove Merritt from the business. In the prosecution's view, this created a financial motive. Merritt allegedly had a significant reason to resent Joseph and to fear the consequences of losing his position in the business. But motive alone could never establish that Merritt committed 4 murders. The prosecution therefore presented additional evidence. One of the most discussed pieces was DNA found in Joseph's Isuzu Trooper. Merritt's DNA was identified as a contributor to samples from areas around the steering wheel and gear shift. The prosecution treated this as a physical connection between Merritt and Joseph's vehicle. The defense, however, had an obvious argument. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. His contact with Joseph and his property was not mysterious. A business partner could have been inside the vehicle without committing a crime. The presence of DNA could therefore demonstrate contact, but it could not establish when that contact occurred or what Merritt had been doing with the vehicle. The prosecution had to place that evidence within a larger timeline. The vehicle itself had another important history. It had been found near the United States-Mexico border, a fact that initially contributed to the theory that the family might have traveled toward Mexico. Computer searches connected to travel to Mexico and documentation for children crossing the border had reinforced that possibility. But once the family's remains were discovered, the interpretation of the vehicle changed. Investigators no longer needed to determine only whether the family had traveled. They needed to determine how the vehicle fit into a homicide. The DNA evidence became part of that investigation, but the original Mexico theory remained an example of how uncertain the case had been during its early years. What had once seemed like evidence of a possible family journey could now be viewed as part of a much more disturbing sequence of events. Another major component of the prosecution's case was phone data. Prosecutors presented evidence that Merritt's phone had been associated with an area near the desert location where the McStay family was buried. The geographical connection was significant because the burial site was far from the family's home. In Fallbrook, the prosecution argued that Merritt's phone activity was consistent with his involvement in the transportation or burial of the bodies. But the defense could challenge the precision and meaning of such evidence. A phone record is not a direct observation of a person's actions. It does not show what the person was doing at a particular location. It does not show whether the person was alone. It does not record a burial. It cannot, by itself, establish that its owner committed a murder. The phone evidence, therefore, had to be interpreted as part of the larger chain. The financial evidence presented another important challenge. Prosecutors alleged that after the McStay family disappeared, Merritt used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks to obtain money. If the jury accepted those allegations, the prosecution could argue that Merritt's behavior after the disappearance supported the financial motive presented earlier. Joseph was allegedly a financial obstacle before the disappearance, and Merritt allegedly attempted to access money connected to Joseph afterward. The prosecution could portray those events as connected. The defense, however, could point to the difference between financial wrongdoing and murder. Even if the alleged financial transactions were proven, they would not automatically establish that Merritt had killed 4 people. The prosecution therefore needed the jury to see the financial evidence not as an isolated crime but as one element of a broader pattern. The prosecution also relied on Merritt's relationship with Joseph and on observations about Merritt's behavior and language after the family disappeared. During an interview with investigators, Merritt referred to Joseph as someone who had been his close friend. The use of the past tense attracted attention because Joseph was still officially missing. Prosecutors could present this as an unusual detail, but it remained a small piece of circumstantial evidence rather than a direct admission of guilt. The defense could argue that words used during an interview should not be transformed into proof of murder without stronger evidence. The most important issue remained the absence of a direct account of the killings. Investigators knew that the 4 victims had suffered blunt force trauma. Joseph had severe skull injuries. Summer had injuries around her jaw. The 2 boys had serious skull injuries, and Johnny had at least 7 head injuries according to evidence presented at trial. Joseph was also found with electrical wire around his neck. A 3-pound sledgehammer was discovered near the burial site. These findings demonstrated the brutality of the crime, but they did not identify the person who had wielded the weapon. They also did not establish exactly where the family had been killed. The grave showed where the bodies had been buried, but the information presented here does not establish that the murders occurred at that same location. This left a significant gap in the reconstruction. If Merritt was responsible, investigators still had to explain how the 4 victims had been killed and transported to the desert. The prosecution did not have a witness who could fill every part of that story. Instead, it argued that the jury did not need to know every minute of the crime to determine who was responsible. A person can be convicted on circumstantial evidence if the evidence, taken as a whole, establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That principle was crucial to the case. The defense, however, could use the same gaps to create reasonable doubt. Merritt had a legitimate connection to Joseph's vehicle. His DNA could therefore have an innocent explanation. Phone data could place his phone in a region without showing exactly what he was doing there. Financial activity could suggest wrongdoing without proving homicide. A business dispute could provide a possible motive without proving that the dispute ended in murder. And the lack of a direct witness meant that no one could tell the jury, from personal observation, that Merritt had committed the killings. Merritt himself maintained that he was innocent. He denied responsibility for the deaths of Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. His position remained fundamentally opposed to the prosecution's theory. The prosecution believed that the individual pieces of evidence reinforced one another. The defense believed that the same pieces could be explained separately and did not bridge the gap between suspicion and proof. That conflict would eventually become the heart of the trial. The jury would have to decide whether the evidence formed a coherent chain pointing to Merritt, or whether too many unanswered questions remained. The McStay case was therefore not a simple story of a suspect caught at the scene of a crime. It was a case in which investigators had to reconstruct events years after 4 people disappeared. The victims had been buried in the desert. The original scene of the killings had not been clearly established. Physical evidence existed, but it did not provide a complete narrative. The prosecution had motive, DNA, phone data, and alleged financial conduct. The defense had the absence of direct witnesses, the alternative explanations for individual pieces of evidence, and the unanswered questions surrounding the actual murders. By the time the case moved toward trial, both sides understood what would determine the outcome. The prosecution would have to persuade the jury that these separate fragments were not unrelated facts but parts of one connected story. The defense would have to persuade the jury that the gaps were too significant to ignore. The question was no longer simply whether Merritt looked suspicious. It was whether the evidence proved that he was the man responsible for the deaths of an entire family. And when the trial finally began in 2019, that question would be placed directly before a jury. By January 2019, nearly 9 years had passed since the McStay family disappeared. Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr. had vanished together in February 2010, and their remains had not been discovered until November 2013. Charles Chase Merritt had been arrested in November 2014 and charged with 4 murders. Now, after years of investigation and legal proceedings, the case finally reached the courtroom. The trial would not revolve around a confession or a single piece of evidence that could explain everything. Instead, it would require jurors to consider a long series of circumstances. Merritt's relationship with Joseph, the alleged financial dispute between them, the DNA found in Joseph's vehicle, phone data associated with the area near the graves, alleged financial activity after the disappearance, and the forensic evidence showing that all 4 members of the family had died violently. The prosecution's task was to convince the jury that these separate facts formed a coherent chain. The defense's task was to show that the chain contained gaps large enough to create reasonable doubt. From the beginning, one of the most important characteristics of the case was the absence of direct evidence. There was no witness who could stand before the jury and say that they had watched Merritt kill Joseph. No one could testify that they had seen him attack Summer or the 2 boys. There was no recording of the murders. There was no confession. Instead, the prosecution had to ask the jury to reconstruct a crime that had taken place years earlier using evidence that survived after the family disappeared. The story presented by prosecutors began with a business relationship between Joseph and Merritt. Joseph operated a business involving fountains and decorative water systems, and Merritt was his business partner. Prosecutors argued that their relationship had become financially troubled. According to the prosecution, Merritt owed Joseph approximately $42,845, while Joseph was trying to remove Merritt from the business. This was presented as a possible motive for murder. The argument was not that a financial dispute automatically led to violence. It was that Merritt's financial circumstances gave him a reason to see Joseph as an obstacle. If Joseph remained alive and controlled the business relationship, Merritt could face financial consequences. Prosecutors argued that eliminating Joseph could change that situation. But the prosecution also had to explain why Summer and the children were killed. That question was especially difficult because the financial dispute primarily involved Joseph. Prosecutors suggested that the children could have been killed because they might have witnessed the killer or recognized him. This explanation was presented as a theory, not as a directly established fact about what happened inside the family's final hours. The forensic evidence showed the consequences, but it did not reveal every decision made by the killer. The 4 victims had suffered blunt force trauma. Joseph had severe injuries to his skull. Summer had injuries around her jaw. The 2 children had serious injuries to their skulls. Johnny, only 4 years old, had sustained at least 7 injuries to his head according to evidence presented at trial. Joseph was also found with electrical wire around his neck. A 3-pound sledgehammer was discovered near the burial site. The evidence made the violence unmistakable, but it did not independently identify Merritt as the person responsible. That was why the prosecution returned repeatedly to the surrounding circumstances. The vehicle was one such circumstance. Joseph's Isuzu Trooper had been found near the United States-Mexico border during the early investigation. After the discovery of the remains, investigators examined the vehicle more closely. Merritt's DNA was identified as a contributor to samples from areas around the steering wheel and gear shift. Prosecutors treated this as an important physical connection, but the defense challenged the implication. Merritt had been Joseph's business partner. He therefore had an ordinary reason to have contact with Joseph's vehicle. The existence of his DNA could not establish when it had been deposited or what he had been doing with the vehicle at the time of the murders. This was precisely the kind of issue that made the trial a battle over interpretation. The prosecution did not need the DNA to stand alone. It needed the jury to see it as one part of a larger pattern. Phone data provided another part of that pattern. Prosecutors presented evidence that Merritt's phone had been associated with an area near the location where the McStay family was buried. The location mattered because the graves were in a remote desert area near Victorville, far from the family's home in Fallbrook. Prosecutors argued that this geographic connection supported their theory that Merritt had been involved in transporting and burying the bodies. The defense could counter that phone location information was not a direct record of a person's actions. It could show an association with an area, but it could not show the exact activity of the phone's owner. It did not capture a murder or a burial. It did not identify a weapon. Again, the evidence had to be interpreted alongside everything else. Financial evidence became another major part of the prosecution's presentation. Prosecutors alleged that after the family disappeared, Merritt used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks to obtain money. This allegation connected the events before and after the disappearance. Before the disappearance, prosecutors said Merritt had a financial conflict with Joseph. After the disappearance, they alleged Merritt engaged in financial conduct involving Joseph's business. To the prosecution, this suggested both motive and benefit. The defense, however, could point out that even financial misconduct did not prove murder. The jury had to determine whether the financial evidence was part of a larger plan or simply evidence of another type of wrongdoing. The prosecution also highlighted Merritt's language during an interview with investigators. When discussing Joseph, Merritt referred to him as someone who had been his close friend. The use of the past tense attracted attention because Joseph was still officially missing at that time. Prosecutors could suggest that the wording was unusual, yet it remained a small detail compared with the physical and financial evidence. It was not a confession and could not independently establish guilt. The defense had the opportunity to emphasize that distinction. The trial therefore became an examination of how much weight should be given to each piece of circumstantial evidence. The prosecution argued that a case does not require a witness to the crime if the surrounding evidence is strong enough. The jury could consider motive, opportunity, physical evidence, location evidence, and conduct after the disappearance. If those facts pointed consistently toward one person, the prosecution argued, they could establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense challenged that conclusion by emphasizing what the prosecution could not show. No one had directly witnessed the killings. The precise location of the murders had not been established from the information presented here. There was no direct evidence showing Merritt wielding the sledgehammer. There was no complete reconstruction of how the bodies were transported from wherever the killings occurred to the desert graves, and there was no confession. Those gaps mattered because the jury was not asked to decide whether Merritt was suspicious. It was asked whether he was guilty. The distinction between suspicion and proof became central to the defense strategy. Merritt maintained that he had not killed the family. His position remained that the prosecution was interpreting ambiguous evidence as though it had only one possible meaning. His business relationship with Joseph could explain the DNA. Phone data could show his phone in an area without proving criminal conduct. Financial transactions could be disputed or interpreted independently of the murders. A strained business relationship could provide a possible motive without demonstrating that Merritt acted on it. The prosecution responded by treating the evidence as interconnected. In their view, the likelihood of every piece independently having an innocent explanation became less persuasive when the pieces were considered together. A financial dispute alone might mean little. DNA alone might mean little. Phone data alone might mean little. Financial activity alone might mean little. But if the same person was connected to all of them, prosecutors argued, the combined evidence formed a compelling pattern. That was the decision the jury ultimately faced. The McStay case had begun as a disappearance in which almost every explanation remained possible. It had evolved into a homicide investigation after the discovery of the 4 bodies. It had then become a prosecution centered on Charles Merritt. Now in the courtroom, the question was whether the years of investigation had produced enough evidence to cross the legal threshold from suspicion to proof. The jury had to consider the evidence without knowing every detail of the family's final hours. They had to determine whether the prosecution's reconstruction was supported by enough independent facts to establish Merritt's responsibility. And after months of testimony and argument, that decision would finally arrive. On June 10, 2019, the jury returned its verdict. On June 10, 2019, after months of courtroom proceedings, the McStay family case reached its decisive moment. Charles Chase Merritt had spent years maintaining that he was not responsible for the deaths of Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr. The prosecution had presented a case built primarily on circumstantial evidence. The financial relationship between Merritt and Joseph, the alleged debt of approximately $42,845, the dispute over Joseph's business, DNA associated with Merritt and Joseph's Isuzu Trooper, phone data connecting Merritt's phone to the general area near the graves, and allegations that Merritt had used Joseph's business accounts and forged checks after the family's disappearance. None of these pieces, considered in isolation, directly showed Merritt committing the murders. But prosecutors argued that the evidence became powerful when considered as a whole. The defense maintained that the prosecution had failed to bridge the distance between suspicion and proof. There had been no eyewitness to the killings. No witness had testified to seeing Merritt attack Joseph, Summer, or the 2 boys. There was no video recording of the murders, no confession, and no definitive reconstruction of every event that occurred during the family's final hours. The defense could therefore point to the unanswered questions that had remained throughout the investigation. Where exactly had the murders taken place? How had the 4 bodies been transported to the desert? Was Merritt alone, or was anyone else involved? Why were the 2 children killed? And could every piece of evidence presented by the prosecution be explained without concluding that Merritt was the killer? These questions formed the foundation of the defense position, but the jury ultimately accepted the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. On June 10, 2019, Charles Merritt was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict represented the culmination of an investigation that had begun with a family simply disappearing from their home in Fallbrook in February 2010. For years, their disappearance had resisted explanation. The discovery of their remains in the desert in November 2013 had finally established that they were victims of homicide. Merritt's arrest in November 2014 had transformed the investigation into a prosecution against a specific suspect. Now the jury had determined that the evidence was sufficient to hold Merritt responsible for all 4 deaths. The verdict was significant not only because it identified a person legally responsible for the murders, but because of the nature of the evidence on which that decision rested. The case demonstrated how a prosecution can be constructed without a confession or a surviving eyewitness. The jury was asked to look at the entire picture rather than searching for one decisive piece of evidence. The financial conflict supplied a possible motive. The alleged financial activity after the disappearance supplied another connection. The DNA evidence connected Merritt to Joseph's vehicle. The phone data connected his phone to the broader region where the bodies were eventually found. The forensic evidence established that the family had died violently and had been buried in the desert. Together, prosecutors argued these facts pointed toward Merritt. The defense had argued that individual pieces of evidence could have innocent explanations. Merritt's DNA could have been in the vehicle because he had been Joseph's business partner. Phone data did not directly show what Merritt had been doing in the desert. Financial misconduct, even if established, did not automatically prove homicide. And a business dispute could create tension without necessarily resulting in murder. Yet the jury concluded that the combined evidence was sufficient. The verdict did not answer every question about the crime. A conviction establishes legal responsibility. It does not necessarily provide a perfect reconstruction of every moment. The precise location where the family was killed remained uncertain from the information presented. Here, the exact sequence of the attacks was not established in complete detail. The identities of any possible accomplices were not established. And the prosecution's explanation for why the children were killed remained a theory rather than a directly witnessed fact. The jury's verdict nevertheless established Merritt's criminal responsibility for the deaths. The case then moved into the sentencing phase. The prosecution sought the harshest possible punishment. The victims were not 4 anonymous names in a case file. They were a family, Joseph and Summer, and their 2 very young sons. Johnny and Joseph Jr. The ages of the children made the case especially devastating. Johnny was only 4 years old. Joseph Jr. was 3. Their deaths were part of the same crime that had taken the lives of their parents. The jury ultimately recommended the death penalty for Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr., while recommending life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for Joseph. On June 24, 2019, the jury's sentencing recommendation was formally recorded. The distinction between the punishments reflected the legal process surrounding the 4 convictions. But for the McStay family, the central fact remained that all 4 members had been killed. Merritt continued to maintain his innocence. He did not accept the prosecution's version of events. His position remained that he had not murdered Joseph or harmed the McStay family. That denial continued through the sentencing process. On January 21, 2020, Judge Michael Smith formally imposed the sentences. Merritt received the death penalty for the murders of Summer McStay, Johnny McStay, and Joseph Jr. He received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of Joseph McStay. The sentence represented the final stage of the criminal case described in the provided information. A disappearance that had once seemed almost impossible to explain had ended with 4 confirmed deaths, a murder conviction, and the most severe punishment available in the case. Yet, even after the verdict and sentence, the unanswered questions did not disappear. The courtroom had established Merritt's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but it did not reconstruct every detail of the family's final hours. There was still no direct eyewitness account of the murders. There was still no complete explanation of precisely where the attacks took place. The desert graves showed where the bodies had been buried, but they did not necessarily represent the original crime scene. The forensic findings revealed the terrible injuries inflicted on the victims, but they could not describe every action that led to those injuries. This distinction is important when looking back at the case. A true crime story can easily become a simple narrative. A family disappeared. Investigators found their bodies. Police arrested a suspect, and a jury convicted him. But the actual investigation was more complicated. For years, investigators had to work without knowing whether the family was alive or dead. The discovery of the graves changed everything. But even then, the identity of the person responsible had to be established through evidence accumulated over time. The prosecution's case was ultimately persuasive to the jury because of the combined weight of that evidence. The verdict therefore closed one chapter of uncertainty while leaving other questions unresolved. For the surviving relatives and everyone who had followed the case, the conviction provided a legal answer to the question of responsibility. Charles Merritt had been found guilty of 4 first-degree murders. But the verdict could not restore Joseph, Summer, Johnny, or Joseph Jr. It could not return the years that their family spent waiting for answers. It could not erase the uncertainty that had surrounded the disappearance from 2010 until the discovery of the remains in 2013. And it could not change the fact that 2 very young children had been among the victims. The McStay case had begun with absence. For people were suddenly gone, and there was no clear explanation. It ended with certainty about the deaths and a criminal conviction, but also with a reminder that legal resolution and complete understanding are not always the same thing. The jury had answered the question of who they believed was responsible. The court had imposed the sentence. Yet the precise story of what happened inside the final hours of the McStay family's lives remained incomplete. That is one of the most haunting elements of the case. The evidence could establish the outcome. It could establish the deaths. It could establish the conviction. But it could not give Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. their final moments back. And for the people who loved them, that absence of a complete explanation would remain part of the tragedy even after the courtroom had delivered its verdict.